Hello everyone, it's new to the webinar day one. So today we have Judah here to bring a topic with title of tipping the scales, rebuttal and weighing mechanism. So without further ado, let's hear from Judah.
Hello everyone. Okay, I'll just share screen first. Okay, wait. Right, can everyone see that good? Good, yeah. Okay, I'm hoping that's okay. Right. So let's just start immediately. So yeah, so for today's, I guess the first day of Seger's webinar, it'll be about tipping the scales, rebuttal and weighing mechanisms. I do want to just flag out that there has been a webinar made on this. I think it was Kat Daud that made it the last time, which was about specifically more about framing, which I think is pretty similar as a topic. So I guess you could kind of see this webinar as a part two to that. I did watch Kat Daud's one first just to make sure I'm not repeating anything so that you have a diversity of resources. But anyway, we'll just get into it. So, wait, okay. So the first thing I want to do is just tell you the resources that I used to make this presentation, or the resources that I've used throughout my time debating and my time understanding what weighing was. So there are about 5 that I listed here. And if you notice, I list a few resources on how to judge correctly. And that's because I don't think you're able to debate properly unless you understand how you are being judged in a debate. So as long as you're able to understand how to judge. So for instance, it's like Kaupi's video from Jofet, if you remember that. And also I included the Wei Udete judging manual just because that's the source that you should be looking towards if you want to understand how to debate in the BP format. So all these resources are really good. I sent these slides to Irene as well. If you want to just look at it at your own time. I will also include some notes after this presentation just to make sure that I'm including anything that I forgot to include or forgot to like put in during this presentation. So now that that's out of the way, let's get into the good stuff. So I'll talk, I guess, about 5 different things in this webinar. I'll talk a little bit about basic rebuttal, stuff that a lot of you probably already know about, but more so like how you integrate basic rebuttal into weighing mechanisms and how you end up like using those things to frame your arguments as well. And secondly is about how to stay within the debate. So it's kind of like how in BP, a lot of teams kind of just throw you out, making sure that you understand how to stay relevant. And most of that is done through staying relevant to the motion and understanding the burdens in the debate. Thirdly is just about different ways that you can weigh your arguments, proper preemption, and also about the broader applications of weighing, how you use that in other ways, I guess you could say. So I want to start off just by explaining what the purpose of, what's the purpose of integrating your rebuttal and your weigh ups. I think something that a lot of people, or I guess a lot of like debaters who've just started off, myself included, you start off having to section like your rebuttal first, and then you get into your arguments. As you evolve as a debater, as you debate a lot more, you'll realize that you have to integrate it because you just have no time in 7 minutes to make all that separate. And you also realize that in many cases, you're just repeating yourself if you rebut and then you argue and then you weigh. So this this webinar is more so to targeted to people, not to force you to structure your speech in a specific way, but to see debate as a more dynamic exercise that you can cater to yourself and how you like to give speeches or how you like to deliver points. So I'm not really going to talk a lot about how you structure that speech, though there will be different styles that I'll talk about, or like different structure that I'll talk about. It's more so understanding debate theory to the extent that you are able to argue not just that something is true, but also that something is extremely relevant and can outframe a lot of different arguments, even arguments that are made really well. Okay, so let's talk about basic rebuttal. And this structure, I think a lot of people already know about, but there are about 4 different ways that you can rebut an argument. And I guess the one thing that I didn't include here is how to rebut non-arguments. But the way that you rebut non-arguments or just context assertions or whatnot are to outframe those arguments rather than to give an actual response against it. So this is something that I repeat a lot to not only like, I guess to Team Indonesia, if any of you are watching, but to a lot of other debaters as well when I give constructive or when they ask for further feedback is an argument structure is always the same every single time. It is premise A being linked to conclusion B. So it always has some kind of factual premise, and it does have to be factual unless otherwise it isn't an argument. Otherwise, it is really easy to destroy as an argument. And it always has a conclusion. What is the outcome of it, be it a principle or a practical outcome? So I like to see it as A to B, and any rebuttal that you come up with attacks some part of that structure. So the rebuttal can target any part of that structure, i.e. the factual accuracy of A, the importance of conclusion B, the link's degree of causality, or like whether or not it can be causally linked to anything else that exists or other premises, for instance, and therefore is not very important as an argument. So 4 ways that you can do this, and I'll just go through this quite quickly. The first is obviously to attack the premise. The argument isn't factually true. I think you can say something like, and this is probably like a flippant example, is the sky is purple, therefore the color purple is really great. The sky isn't purple. But that's a pretty flippant one. I guess the other type of example that I can think of would probably be that people using characterizations that aren't actually true. So for instance, the reason why we find sexist or racist characterizations or characterizations that are too general about immigrants, for instance, being like less productive or whatnot, those things are obviously untrue to a very large degree. So it's really easy for you to rebut those things. And that's why I put that as a first layer of rebuttal, just because it probably isn't the one that you'll use most often, because when you go against slightly better teams or teams who can actually argue to a pretty large extent with a lot of reasons, you can't really just use that first rebuttal against them. The second way is analysis, just to show that the argument doesn't follow clear logical steps. And here's where you hear a lot of judges saying stuff like, you did not process this out correctly. And when teams point out that you didn't process it out correctly, it kind of defeats the whole argument, just because even though it follows the burdens of the motion, or even though it actually analyzes it correctly, it like reaches the burden that it imposes upon you. It doesn't end up being a good argument just because it doesn't have clear steps of analysis that actually ends up reaching that conclusion. So it's kind of like delivering a factual premise, delivering a good conclusion, but not giving enough links to prove that argument. The third is just comparative. Does the alternative provide more benefits? So what this is to say is like when people say, here's why our side is better, you say, no, it's not better because the world looks like XYZ. Right? And we'll go into that a bit more when we're talking about weighing. But the final one, and probably the most important one, is just impact. The impact is insignificant, even if the whole argument is true. So that's really the 4 ways that you can rebut an argument. I think every other iteration of a rebuttal kind of centralizes on those four key things. So it's either premise, analysis, comparative, or impact, targeting one of those things. Again, because an argument structure is really simple. Obviously, you can encounter teams that go from point A to point B to point C to point D in order to prove a grand point E, for instance. But the way that you rebut it is quite similar, that if you cannot target every single logical link, you target the frame overall that says the argument is important. You can say the argument is unimportant, and therefore you don't need to respond to as much as possible. And again, I think you will hear this a lot, that debate is a constrained optimization exercise, which basically means you are unable to rebut every single thing from, let's say like you're a closing government, like you're a government whip, can't respond to like 3 different speeches from the opposition and weigh yourself against your opening team in 7 minutes. So you would have to like skirt away from that and try to find ways to be smarter in using your time correctly. So that's basic rebuttal. And I guess the next thing to talk about is just how you integrate that into weighing. 3 different ways. The first is to reject the argument completely. The second is to scale the argument, and third is to flip. So what this is to say is like, it's kind of like a similar thing that I talked about here, but you can either like reject an argument completely to say this is something I don't really care about. You can scale it by saying it's not very important, or you can flip it by saying, yes, it is important, but I reach it better, right? And I think this is pretty intuitive. We'll now just get into stuff about weighing. So I have also included some examples throughout this PowerPoint. So like, it isn't just like I intend for this session to sort of be like simple theories that like you can use that a lot of people probably know about, but they don't know how to apply it in a debate, for instance. So the next thing to ask is how to stay within the debate and understanding how to like create burdens for your team. Okay, so the motion, and this was from Pre-Korea Worlds. It was, this house believes that the theory of communism is moral. Speaker is Ignacio, world finalist. Let's just watch how he frames the opening government team.
But before that, I just want to take down the implied POI coming from closing opposition. So they said, are the alternatives better? Note the burden of this motion specifically. It's not to say that communism is worse than any other political outcome. It is our political system. It's just to say that communism is immoral. It is possible that multiple systems are immoral. It's possible even if one system is less bad than another system, that both of them are equally immoral. In the same way, you can have two very bad boyfriends, even if one potential boyfriend might be marginally better than the other. That's important because no matter what closing opposition says about why maybe capitalism might be immoral or any other form of current systems are immoral, doesn't disprove the claim that this particular system is immoral, and therefore we still take the debate, assuming they try to prove that.
Yeah, so what was done there was really simple. It was to say the prop burden isn't to prove alternatives to a more moral system of governance, but rather to just prove that communism itself is immoral, or is a priori immoral, I guess. And so that kind of locks out the opposition of saying, due to the fact that other systems are better, or like due to the fact that other systems are worse, for instance, communism is preferable to that. Preferability is not a metric in the debate, and that's why opening government won the debate. So then it kind of begs the question, how do you apply it to further debates, right? I think I've identified 3 different ways to apply it. The first was to just understand the type of motion that you're dealing with. So you only need to prove X to win. So in this motion, if it was worded in the way that says, this house believes that the theory of communism is the most preferable, or like the system of communism is the most preferable system, then that obviously shifts the burden of the debate. OG would have to talk about why communism is preferable in light of other alternatives or in light of other systems existing. In that way, like, you have to understand what the motion is talking about in order to be able to win the debate, right? We generally know to offer alternatives. We generally know to make arguments and prove why they are true. But sometimes we spend time on things that are unimportant. And one of those things that would be unimportant in this motion is to talk about alternatives. The second way to stay within the debate, or to understand how to prove your burden well, is to evaluate the general consensus in the round. So the general consensus would kind of be, if every team in that 4-team round, which is like a BP round, or even in an AP round or a World Schools round, let's say, if both teams are kind of going at the same end goal of protecting the vulnerable, which is probably more likely in an AP or World Schools round, or if, like, let's say in BP, top half talks about being able to reach the largest amount of capital in order to unlock other kinds of things, like, let's say it's about an individual being able to achieve like largest amount of capital versus living an average mediocre life that is more peaceful. The opening half will kind of talk about utility as the main metric of the round, right? It is then important for you not to just explain why the way you saw the debate or the way you push your arguments in the debate, why that's the most important. You also have to be able to explain that in light of the stuff that's already been explained. So you can do that in one of 2 ways. Again, you can prove why you best reach that consensus goal or benefit. So if you're in a closing opposition team, you talk about the 3 teams that just existed like before you. Or if you're an opening government, let's say, you can kind of frame in the debate. The second way is to prove why your material end up outweighing that consensus goal or benefit, right? So that's kind of what is done in that line that I just played for you here. In that line, the speaker was attempting to explain why their case, even though it's just one line of why communism is immoral without any kind of contingency plan or like even ifs or whatever, that line is able to be framed as the most important in the debate because they were able to frame what is the metric of morality and why does the metric of morality doesn't apply to their existing more preferable systems. I guess the final thing to note here is just, as a closing team, what do you do? As a closing team, you can counter the plausibility of the opening team's framing by asking, would it really be a fair debate if this metric was used to win the round. So for instance, it's kind of like if the opening team says, or like if the government team says, for instance, right, like if you're a closing opposition team, if the government team says something like, you guys need to prove why there is absolute harm or why the harm is 100% going to happen, but they only prove likelihood of a benefit existing, you could say that would be pretty weird to push as a burden, just because if the benefit from the government side is speculative, the harm that they impose or the like burden push of a harm that they impose on the opposition would also equally have to be speculative, or also have to be like mech'd out in terms of likelihood, right? So you do not need to prove certainty of harm existing. You just need to prove higher likelihood of certainty, or higher likelihood of that harm existing, basically, right? So it is an unfair burden push, and I think this is how you can deal with teams who kind of sneakily try to push you into trying to prove, or like into having to prove something that you don't really need to prove. But then comes the even if, right? Like regardless of whether or not it is fair, does it really take into account the more urgent issue in the round? And then you have to frame what is the most urgent issue in the round. And that kind of goes into, oh, wait, sorry. Right, that kind of goes into the main thrust of this presentation, which is how do you actually weigh your arguments, right? And this I think I want to say is you already bringing your argument, so you've already proven truth in that argument. So for instance, it's kind of like saying, let's say it's a social movement argument or like a social movement debate. The opposition says something like, we do not need critical mass from individuals on the ground. What we need is critical mass of elites. And the way that you get elites to agree with you is through blah, 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 right? Or is through motion. And they prove this efficiently, let's say, right? That after you've done that, then it comes time to like weigh that argument, right? So let's just go into the 5 ways that you can do that. So the first way you can do that is to talk about the certainty of outcomes. And that's basically you trying to prove that your argument will materialize or will happen, and that given it is certain to happen, it proves the highest threshold of likelihood, or like the highest threshold of a burden in the round, or this being like the most likely case, and therefore, regardless of how large the impact is from any team, those impacts, again, were speculative, our impacts were certain, and thus must be judged to be the most important argument. So it's kind of, it looks like saying this duty that we prove to you to be true must be followed, otherwise you no longer exist as a moral agent. Non-existence is a certain outcome. So it's kind of like saying teachers must do X thing. If they don't do X thing, they are no longer a teacher, or they have foregone the right of being a teacher, or foregone the right of being considered a teacher. And therefore, because you no longer exist as that thing, you no longer, that's like the biggest harm in the debate, or like that's the most important outcome in the debate. And I think this usually applies in more principled debates. So it's a bit difficult for you to prove likelihood mechanisms to be certain, just because they're just proving likelihood, they're not proving certainty. So in principled debates, it's usually done to prove the importance of it. So for instance, what is the moral duty? What is their obligation as an actor? What is the necessary moral outcome? That's how you can win with a principle argument. I think the reason why a lot of people, I guess like in recent times, a lot more people have been using principle arguments to try to win debates. In the past, they haven't. The reason why is probably because those arguments were not weighed or not proven to the extent that it could be proven. And in actuality, if you were able to prove that a duty exists for this actor or an obligation exists for this actor, you're probably able to weigh that quite easily by saying this is a certain duty or a certain obligation. The metric to judge this round is on which team is best able to reach that duty. And that probably is really easy to prove, especially in an actor debate, for instance, right? In an actor debate, you cannot ascertain what the actor wants, because what they want in day 1 might be different from what they want in day 50. The easiest way for you to do that, or the easiest way for you to win that debate, is to explain why is this outcome of you no longer being that actor, or you foregoing the moral necessity to be that actor, why is that the most important thing in the debate? The way to do that is uncertainty. Okay, I don't know who that was. Right, so the second way to weigh, I'm sorry, I'm saying weigh way too many times, is to talk about past precedents. That looks like saying something like, this claim is consistent with things that have worked in the past and things that have been prioritized in the past. So it's not just about saying this thing is the same as what happened 200 years ago, because some horrible stuff happened 200 years ago, doesn't mean it's good, right? The way that you actually use past precedents to weigh your arguments is to take into account what I noted here. So this method of weighing takes into account the broad sweep of progress rather than one specific event where one actor chose to do one specific action, right? So you cannot say, because this happened in the 1920s, it must happen in 2021. That doesn't work, right? And it's really easy for teams to rebut that just because they're talking about, like, they can talk, like they can reference progress or the actual way to use this technique. The way you use this technique is to explain that from, like, throughout, like, let's say the fruition of democracy up until now, this is how the progress has gone so far. And the way that you follow this trend of progress is to follow our side of the house, or is to propose this motion or to oppose this motion, right? So that's how you use it. You don't point it to one particular time, you have to point to a trend that exists up until today. So the application is usually in debates about legality. So it's kind of like saying, this actor or this outcome has to be prioritized as it has always been prioritized for the following reasons, right? Or it has been recently prioritized for the following reasons. And you do have to point out those reasons, right? So it's like, why is rehabilitation prioritized a bit more? Because it is rooted upon the necessity to reconstruct society or to make society better. As long as it doesn't reach that goal, it is no longer important, or it no longer exists. So that's how you use past precedents to weigh your arguments. There are two other ways to weigh. And this one, and this third one I want to get into is probably the biggest one, or like the way that a lot of people have told you to like frame your arguments to be important, right? But it's not just about talking, like, it's not just like saying my impact is important because my impact is huge, right? That makes sense, but that's an assertion, which the other team can also say about their arguments, right? So it doesn't really give judges any metric to judge the debate on. The way you win this debate is by explaining it in the following metrics. So there are about 5 metrics of impacting. The first is to talk about the quantity of individuals. That's the first level. And that level can be destroyed by the concentration towards a minority of individuals, which basically says something like, even if their other side, so it's kind of like the simple market, free market argument, right? Free markets are good because they have the potential to offer lower prices for the most vulnerable in society. This helps the most vulnerable. This helps a lot of individuals. The way you rebut that is really simple, by saying it helps them extremely marginally, to the extent that even if 1 million people have 1 rupiah or like 1,000 rupiah lower for their goods, that benefit is never felt by any of the individuals, even though the accumulated benefit is large. But that accumulated benefit is better allocated towards individuals who struggle the most, because absent that benefit, they no longer have the ability to eat. They no longer have the ability to like be productive. They will essentially have to pass away, or they essentially have to incur massive harms, right? So that's how you are able to wash out teams that kind of claim consumer benefits as an impact that has to be prioritized. Because even though the accumulated benefit is huge, the felt benefit is non-existent or extremely tiny, right? That's how you can use concentration to really like compare impacts, basically. And that also looks like the replaceability of an impact, or the exclusivity of an impact, which is to say that it might be true that the motion produces this impact, and it might be true that that impact is concentrated to an individual in such a huge way. And it might also be true that it is to a huge quantity of individuals, but it is untrue that that motion was the sole cause of that impact, or that you only necessitated that thing to create that impact, or to create that benefit. For that reason, you didn't have to care about it at all, right? You can also weigh your impacts in terms of its spheres. So some team can talk about how this is beneficial for the individuals, for individual economy, or like for someone's financial setting, basically, but that thing was unimportant insofar as you compare that to someone's mental health, because a targeting towards your mental health meant that you could not use any money, or like no money generally would be able to achieve any benefits for you, right? So you can use this to kind of take down arguments that have all 3 points of weighing on impact. You take that down by saying that sphere of impact is immediately outweighed by this different sphere of impact, which is felt more by an individual. And the final point of impacting, and I know some of you might have already read this line, but it's kind of like comparing the short term versus the long term. And I think this is something that people, or like debaters generally, kind of take for granted. They say stuff like, the short-term impacts are unimportant because we are already able to explain to you long-term impacts. Long-term impacts do not immediately mean that you are immediately winning over a team that only talks about short-term or like is thinking in a short-term way. The reason is because, and I'll point you to an example, yeah? The example is the finalist of Australs, particularly in the DPM speech, they argued that short-term decisions are important or have to be prioritized because that is when people feel their emotions most intensely. So because people feel those emotions most intensely, they're unlikely to make a wrong decision as of day 50 compared to day 1 of like let's say people who are grieving the loss of a loved one, for instance. And for that reason, you had to prioritize the short term in contrast to the long term, right? So it can really go both ways, but you have to be quite strategic with this. And the best way to be strategic is to use a mixture of impact mechanisms, I would say, in terms of weighing your arguments, yeah? So there's no absolute, like it doesn't, like just because you say more people impacted, it doesn't mean that you're immediately winning in terms of impact, in the same way that a concentration of impact doesn't immediately win over a quantity of impact, right? It all kind of interacts with one another. The best way that you can win the debate is to evaluate what teams are claiming and see which point of impact mechanism is able to destroy that the best. And I guess then the fourth thing, kind of similar to that third one, is just the irreversibility of change. And this kind of talks about how the impact that is caused in the debate or the outcome that is caused cannot be like reversed or cannot be fixed in the long run, basically, right? So that's why you have to care about it a lot. So the way that you do this is you can conclude that your end outcomes have no potential of getting reversed or can never be corrected again going into the future. So you also have to prove then that one's capacity to choose. So for instance, it's like if you commit this harm to someone, that someone is gonna feel that harm for the rest of their lives. And for that reason, you have to care about that. That's usually the argument to show why victims are significantly more important in contrast to the person who does that problem or like commits that crime, right? It's because there is an irreversibility of impact, because it might, like, to some individuals, it might seem like it's not huge, but it is massive to that particular individual. And also because they can never forget that thing that happened to them, for instance, right? So the application can be to psych debates or like debates about an individual or whatnot. But it can also apply to IR debates. So it kind of looks like saying, pulling out of this one treaty or this one deal will entail destroying, just like destroying all future deals. There is an irreversibility of impact here. Therefore, even if the opposition argument is larger in terms of impact, it can easily be reversed. Our impact cannot be reversed. Therefore, you have to prioritize ours instead of theirs. So that is how you use that weighing mechanism. Okay, the fifth way, and I think this might be slightly unique. Hopefully it is unique. I haven't seen a lot of people talk about it, but it is about prerequisites, right? So you weigh your argument to be the key access to everything the debate has been discussing thus far. So it's kind of like, it's you trying to claim everything in the debate in order to get a first, right? And this is particularly quite useful when, I guess, like different teams talking about different things. So for instance, there was this one debate where so okay, let's use the social movements example, right? The motion, I think, was about this house would, wait, okay, I forgot the motion, but basically the opening government was arguing that you need to have a lot of people agreeing with you first in order for that social movement to be beneficial, which is quite intuitive, right? Like if a lot of people agree with you, that means you have a lot of political capital. That means you are able to do things like pass policies. You're able to socialize people into believing what is correct and what is incorrect. The OO says, no, you have to get buy-in from elites, because elites are able to change institutions. Elites are able to pass policies. Elites are able to action out all the impacts that you want. And this thing is more important than the opening government case, because this impact is able to meaningfully change the lives of people. So it is more certain, it is like just larger, it is more certain to happen, right? Now, both teams already like correctly use like weighing mechanisms for each of their side, right? What closing opposition can do is closing opposition can find a way to integrate both of those things, right? So they can say something like, on our side of the house, we are able to get a lot of buy-in from a lot of people. Oh, okay, now I remember the motion. Okay, so the motion was about this house would use like academic language-ish. Like this was a debate at Worlds. This house would use more academic ways of thinking to talk about social movements, right? In that motion, the closing opposition can say something like, actually, when you use academic language, that is better to not only co-opt elites, but it is also able to meaningfully explain the experiences of vulnerable individuals. So for instance, even if you weren't the smartest person, even if you didn't have access to education as like in contrast to the elite in society, academic language used in social movements, for instance, like Judith Butler's gender theory even, but other stuff like critical race theory, and also like, I guess, the ways that we understand the gaslighting of certain privileged groups over more vulnerable groups, for instance, the way that we understand the psychological constructions of racism, that is better able to, that creates a more meaningful experience for the vulnerable in society, right? So even though they don't understand academic language, and even though the vast majority of people aren't able to relate to academia, they're able to relate to academia that can meaningfully explain their experiences. And that's why you don't only capture elites as a group that buys into your movement on the closing opposition side, you also co-opt a lot of the benefits that opening government was talking about, right? So this is a way to kind of show why the prerequisite to achieving everything that top half wanted to talk about is through the closing opposition case. And they got a first in that debate. So you have to weigh your argument to be the key access, or like the key to access everything that the debate has been discussing thus far. And it's just like the most important step to getting those benefits, basically, right? And this is particularly a useful way to kind of resolve the deadlock, I guess, the deadlock in opening, which a lot of people say. Again, like I said before, this can be used to talk about the prerequisite to my opponent's arguments. It can be used to talk about the prerequisite of any outcome in the debate. So even if, I guess, the opening bench didn't have a deadlock and was talking about the same thing, like how do you get critical mass, closing opposition can point to the mechanism in the round and prove why only their side of the house is able to get those impacts absent the discussion in opening bench. So that's how you weigh. Let's look at how a really good speaker is able to weigh their arguments. Okay, so this was Tin's speech in the leader of opposition, and I just want to flag out firstly the purposes of weighing before we watch this speech, because it will be like a bit matter heavy. The purpose isn't just to prove why you are more important; it is to also explain what are the implications of your claim. So that kind of looks like, what does this claim mean, basically, right? Because sometimes you can prove an argument to be true, but no one really understands what you're talking about, or like no one really understands how it engages in the round, right? Weighing isn't particularly meta framing, but it could be as well, because it talks about the debate rather than the argument. It can also like open room for like just more analysis and more nuanced analysis, probably can help you achieve higher speaker scores as well, and like win the round by pumping the claim with much more importance or much more necessary, like it being just like much more necessary for teams to respond fully to that rather than just to the premise of your argument, right? So weighing is a way to kind of mitigate the 4 types of basic rebuttal that I talked about at the start of this webinar. So let's watch the way that Tin weighs his argument.
These policies, many developing countries don't have that. What is the weighing here? The weighing is that many less developed countries have a necessity to breach these policies in order to be able to implement any kind of healthcare policy, which means that you put them between a rock and a hard place of deciding between prosecution and the health of their people. And if you do efficiently prosecute, you make them less able to implement any health policy in the first place. But secondly, insofar as the countries deciding these policies are those who are least fucked up, I think they have less knowledge of what is happening on the ground and therefore more likely to implement negative standards because they do not have the oversight of what's going on. But
okay, so that was a bit much. So if you didn't catch that, it's okay. I wrote it down for you. What is the weighing, right? So what did Tin actually weigh in that speech? So the motion was, this House supports the creation of an international court with a mandate to prosecute leaders for health crimes. This is an argument for the opening opposition. The opening opposition argument was that Western standards would be useful for this court, or like would be used for this court, and not other kinds of objective standards. So the objective standard would be rooted upon Western standards because Western countries are the ones that have good healthcare systems or whatnot, and therefore it would be biased. right? And you're probably able to reasonably prove that it is going to be biased because it is like they reference all their health policies upon the West rather than any other country. So that's pretty intuitive, I guess, but it was also like proven in that speech, obviously. There were 2 points of weighing. The first point of weighing was to say developing countries must breach this court's policies in order to create any meaningful healthcare policies, which is to say that they must make a difficult decision between prosecuting their leaders and protecting the health of their people, or to ensure the health of their people, right? So what this kind of says is you are forcing them into an impossible decision. And note, I guess, the keywords force and must is that like this policy necessitates them to do something that is irreversible in terms of harms or irreversible in terms of impacts, right? And again, I think it's like there's no specific way to weigh your arguments. It's just about evaluating the different theories of weighing mechanisms and how you can use that in a debate. So I guess the purpose of that first weighing mechanism in that speech was to say that this is what like the end outcome is. That's why that end outcome was irreversible, and that's why you had to care about that end outcome. The second point of weighing was to say Western countries who have pretty good healthcare policies are bad decision makers, as they just do not understand what is happening in developing countries. They don't have the contextual knowledge. This is an argument that is usually used when people say local governments are better able to govern, or like better able to should have access to more infrastructure because they have more knowledge or they have specific knowledge. Think, for instance, in police abolition motions, the reason why we kind of forward the claim that community watchdogs or like community watchers is better than over policing in certain areas is because those community watchdogs actually understand what that community needs and has a personal relationship with people in that community, right? So in this case, you're kind of talking about impact generally, right? So it is pretty low impact to have Western countries to have this international court get based on Western standards, which is likely to happen. It is better that these countries just determine it for themselves what is best for them, right? So therefore, the creation of an international court is unimportant or should not be done, right? So it directly proves what the opposition is supposed to prove. And that's a good way to weigh your arguments, just because it might seem as though it either like repeats the intent of the argument or it just talks about the impact of the argument. In the end, though, it is a necessary step to really show to the judges, here's why this claim about bias wins the round, right? This claim about bias wins the round because we prove to you the largest harm that can happen, but also we prove to you the harm is irreversible, or that the harm is, I guess, like irreversible and certain to happen, right? So I think I think there are about 2 things that apply to this one sentence here. Is like it is irreversible and it is certain to happen because you force them into that like really difficult decision of prosecution or ensuring the health of their people through like local health policies. And the fourth thing I want to talk about, and this is kind of nearing the end, is preemption. So this is like sort of used for speakers either in the PM or the LO in both AP and BP, or the, I guess, member speeches, right? It oftentimes isn't used for whip speeches just because you are already able to know everything that's happening in the round. This is really important because as long as you prove an argument to be true and you weigh that argument to be important, but if you don't have even ifs, you might still, or like you have like the same chance of losing the round as any other team, basically, right? Because in order to meaningfully use weighing mechanisms, or in order to appropriately compare your case to another team's case, you have to understand what their side would bring, right? And that's why it is encouraged for you to ask for POIs. It is encouraged for you to give POIs, right? Which is why, like, if an opening government team gets a point from the closing opposition team, what they do is they impromptu just make a weighing, like a point of weighing against that, right? So it's like, if your case is blah, 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 here's how our case interacts with that, right? Given that we try our best to assume what the other team would bring, because you can like reasonably infer from the motion what the opposition team or what the proposition team would bring. in BP, it becomes a bit more tricky because you don't know what the closing would bring in contrast to the opening teams, right? So preemption is really important, not just in terms of like including it in your argumentation, but also in like responding to teams that might have a completely different case, but like actually wipe you out of the debate, right? So preemption is anything between saying, even if they say this, my claim is more important, or my impacts are more important, or my impacts will exist. Even if you don't buy this argument, you have to buy this other argument or this other mechanism that I gave to you. Thus, my argument is still true, blah, blah, blah. And even if our opposition is correct, this actually hurts them more. Our arguments, this other argument is able to interact with that, or this is just not as important, right? So reusing a lot of the weighing mechanisms that we talked about before. This is kind of like a way to utilize it in your speeches. So I have identified about 4 different ways to preempt correctly, or like 4 different purposes of preemption, basically. The first and probably the more flippant one is to call the team out for being inconsistent. So if this characterization held true, this other characterization didn't like cannot also hold true, right? So the purpose was the purpose in here is just to be like to make this as an attack against them, or like just makes this attack against you like less plausible, right? So you're doing like 2 things at once. Basically, you were saying the argument that they're forwarding cannot coexist, or like the 2 arguments that they are forwarding cannot coexist. And so by comparison, you are more likely to win the round because you are consistent, right? I don't encourage this to be used every single time, just because sometimes teams are not inconsistent, or like they're actually consistent. And if you call them out for something that they're not doing, that is a straw man, or that just gets the judge to be a bit pissed at you because they know that it wasn't a contradictory statement, right? Another thing you can do is to point to one of your other actors. So it might be true that this actor gets harmed, this other actor is more important, and this other actor gets benefited. Care about this other actor, right? So it makes your arguments more nuanced, like to say something like, it isn't just about protecting the economy, it is also about ensuring a good livelihood for the poor. And so both kinds of like the institution, like not the institution, but rather like the whole concept of a strong economy is not just important in and of itself. It is important in relation to every other actor. You can also talk about this in motions where you can talk about like friends versus family, for instance. Like, yes, it might be true that your friends get hurt, but you have to prioritize your family because blah, 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 for instance. So it like there's like a wide variety of things that you can do with this thing, which is like to point to another actor that you've already analyzed to benefit, or you've analyzed to get harmed on the other team. But this is like quite useful for you to be able to, I guess, win the round on different metrics. So this is like the technique of like washing out one of your arguments, right? Given that at the end of the debate, it might be true that your practical gets washed out, or it might be true that one impact gets washed out. That doesn't matter as long as you are able to have other arguments or other things that you were able to prove, right? And if it's just a single case like speech, you can still be able to win that in these final 2 ways. Yeah. So what you can do is you can point to a worse comparative. So the purpose here was to just prove why on a scale your opponent incurs larger harms or extremely tiny benefits. Or you can also point to one of your other mechanisms. So it's kind of like when people say something like I have 3 structural reasons or 4 structural reasons, they rebut the first one, they don't rebut the last 3. The purpose here was just like just to show the judge that your claims still stand or are still robust, because the argument doesn't fall just because one characterization holds true on the opposition. But even if the judges like don't buy that completely, it will just force them to credit you for all your material. So I guess this is kind of like the strategy in BP is like you lose, but you lose on a tiny margin, or you lose, but you're a second and not a first, but that's still probably breaking, right? So this applies to like overall strategy on how to advance yourself to the next round. It is about like being able to win the round, but it is also about being able to be one of the more contributive teams in the round. So you can place highly even if you don't place first. And I guess the final thing is just broader applications. So how do you use weighing other than directly putting it at the final part of your argument, or at the start of your speech or whatnot, right? 3 different ways. The first is to use it as an intuition pump. So prove that something is important before proving it. This is done a lot by Australian speakers, I think, like when they just like start their speech with an opening line, or not just Australian speakers, like a lot of speakers generally. They start off with an opening line because you have to prepare the judge, so to speak, for what you're about to prove. So if you're about to prove something particularly controversial or particularly different from what your opening was bringing, this is really important, because if you develop some intuition for that point, it is more likely that the judge will buy it, or more likely that it sounds more important. And that kind of goes in conjunction with the second point of like what you can use weighing for. So you can frame it as intent. So you say, this argument will prove blah, 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 or as long as I prove blah, 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 I will win the round. And the third way, and this probably applies a bit more to world schools, but also applies to BP actually, is to signpost and to use style a lot more. So it's about making your way ups clear to the judge and explicitly telling them like both what your argument is and how they should credit it in relation to other teams. So instead of like, again, it's not about the simple way of saying my argument is high impact. It is about my argument shows to you the prerequisite of getting every other impact, or my mechanisms are the way that you can understand how this institution works. And because you are able to understand how this institution works, you are then able to understand what they can do to maximize impacts for themselves or maximize impacts for people on the ground, for instance, right? So that just allows you to sound more nuanced, but it also allows you to like make sure everything that you're saying ends up getting credited, because sometimes it doesn't get credited, even if the judge is able to fully hear and comprehend what you're talking about, because there wasn't an explicit point from where you said, this thing is more important than that thing because of blah, blah, blah. Like you have to actually be explicit on that. Otherwise, it might not be like credited fully, and it might not be credited, like it might be correctly not credited by the judge, basically, because you didn't prove that importance layer. And sometimes actually it can mean that in BP rounds as well, if you talk about the framing for why your opening team's mechanisms are important, you could win the round, because without that layer of analysis, the argument from the opening teams are not important, right? So you can use this as a full case. You can also use this as you should obviously use this if you're an opening team to prove why your arguments are the most important in the round, locking out the closing government or the closing opposition from being able to take it over you at least. So that's it. Any questions? I'll just stop. I can stop screen sharing, or yeah, I'll stop screen sharing. But if anyone has any questions, I can open up the slides again, and then we can discuss specific parts of the slides if anyone's confused about anything. But yeah, I don't know how you can send questions. Maybe Irene, would they send it to you?
You can just unmute yourself, but we actually already have one here. The question is how to think clearly and out of the box while debating under pressure.
That's a pretty tricky one, just because I think every debater is a bit different. But how to think outside of the box, the way that you do that is to first think inside the box, which is to say, what is the burden of the round? And this is something that I've realized quite recently is, as a closing team, you don't case build by just thinking, what are the most unique things or crazy thing that you can say? What is the most unexpected thing to say in the debate? That's not how you win. You win by first evaluating what is the burden, what are the burdens in the round, or what does the round necessitate for you to talk about. And then from that point, you can see all the different things that you can explain. Now, that is just about case line, right? In most cases, some opening teams are not able to fully mechanize an argument or use one mechanism to prove an argument. So you kind of say something like, what's an example for this? Yeah. Oh, this house would make development aid conditional on the country, on that developing country to improve their democratic index, for instance, right? You would basically say they can only get development aid unless they can only get it unless if they improve their democracy in some kind of way. The proposition or the opening government could kind of say something like, well, like money is a really important thing, and therefore, because like money is an important thing for developing countries, they would have to agree to this policy or have to agree with this conditionality. And therefore, this is gonna be good for democracy, right? That is a one mechanism argument. And they can talk about that for about 3 minutes just because it takes a lot to explain why there is an incentive, right? The closing government team doesn't necessarily need to bring a completely new argument in order to win the round. The closing government team can do two things. The first is to fully flesh out why it is, why the only incentive, for instance, is to take this, and in contrast to any other things. Because for instance, like the opposition team can say something like, well, they're just not going to take the deal because even though money is important to them, that specific country offering that money isn't important to them. The country that is more important is, for instance, China, and they'll just turn to China or whatnot, right? Then the closing government team can just use that to explain, here's why, like using the way up of irreplaceability, right? Here's why this specific policy is irreplaceable. And for that reason, we win the round because we prove the more consistent, the more likely mechanism, but also the more robust mechanism than the opening government. The second thing that they would do is to obviously frame that extension to be important, or to frame that argument to be important. So again, it's not really about being able to come up with the freshest ideas, to come up with completely new ideas. It's to come up with the simple case lines or the simple burdens of the round, which I think a lot of people are able to do. But then after that point, come up with a lot of different reasons, or the strongest reasons for why that thing is true. So this is both a technique that can be used for the opening teams, which is the opening teams can come up with a lot of different mechanisms for why X thing is true. Closing teams can come up with a lot of different framing mechanisms or weighing mechanisms for why that argument is the most important in the round, right? So you can make it like a gov bench win or an op bench win, but you would still be able to place first as a closing team because you offer the more important material in the debate. Yeah, I think that answers the question. Hopefully it does. If anyone else has any other questions, feel free to either type it in the chat, or you can, you can just unmute if you want. If you want me to like go through the slides again, or like parts of the slides, I'm willing to do that as well. I'll ask Irene if you have any questions.
I honestly don't have any question because it's so clear.
Well, yeah, but if so like if anyone has anything else, like even if it's not particularly about the slides, like about weighing mechanisms, I guess I can talk about other things as well. But in terms of in terms of like not cracking under pressure, I guess, or like being able to operate well under pressure, it really is just like a you thing, or like you have to kind of deal with that or find a way to deal with that. The best way is to just look at debate in a simple way. What is the motion? What is the motion about? And then it becomes really easy for you to come up with the correct arguments or the most impactful arguments. Yeah, so just like seeing it in a more simple way allows you to come up with more complex ideas or stronger ways to prove complex topics, basically. Yeah. So I guess I'll just wait here unless anyone has any other questions. If not, yeah. Any other questions? I'll just count down to 5. If not,
Maybe we have one.
Oh, okay, cool.
As a web speaker, it's really hard for me to kind of rebut and make to point out the difference between my team and my opening team. Do you have the most effective way to do that? Because sometimes it is counted as sniping in my case.
Oh yeah. So before I answer that, someone just said in the chat that sounds like a you problem. That's not what I'm saying. It's not that it sounds like a you problem. It's more so that like you have to find ways to progress from that point yourself, and that just entails more practice, practicing with different motions as well, and just doing more debates generally. But to answer that question about I guess comparing or weighing yourself to your opening teams, making it explicit that you're not rebutting them, you are just proving why theirs is less important than yours, I think that's the easiest way to do that. So it's kind of like crediting your opening teams for what they have to be credited for, but crediting your team for what you are able to bring to the table, right? So I guess there are a couple of things to note. The first thing to note is just that to make sure that you're not lying. So sometimes teams kind of say like, our opening doesn't really explain anything, and that's why we win the debate. Like that's not very good debating, but like more importantly as well, it doesn't really prove anything other than repeating what your speaker has already been able to say. The best kind of comparison, I think, to opening teams is to be the most fair person or the most charitable like debater as possible in that room or in that round. So you can say the opening team is able to correctly identify the principle in the round and is able to give one or two mechanisms for it, but they aren't able to prove the most important or irreversible impact in the round as we were able to do. And that is why ours obviously compares higher in contrast to theirs. Or you can kind of say something like the opening opposition, like if you're a closing opposition team, just making it explicit what their contribution was and crediting them for that contribution. And then you get into what your contribution is. So I think it's like the easiest way to do this is to just be explicit. So like be explicit and be fair. A lot of teams end up winning because they are more charitable than other teams. So it's like operating on the worst case scenario does end up allowing you to win over other teams just because that proves how you are the most engaging in the round, but also proves how you absorb the other team's benefits or absorb the other team's claims. But also just making sure that you are quite explicit in the way that you say, here's what my speaker was able to give to you. Why is that specific thing able to win us the round, right? So you can't say, my speaker was able to prove to you a principle. Like, so what? What is that principle? You usually do something like, my speaker was able to tell you this mechanism or these mechanisms, and here's why those mechanisms were more important, right? So I think explicitity is the way for you to be able to correctly, I guess, win over opening teams. You can't win by lying. You can't win by kind of straw manning cases. You have to win by being quite charitable. Whoops. Okay. Yeah. So I hope that answers the question. If you have any follow-up questions, you can just type it in the chat or you can unmute. And yeah, someone just asked another question in the chat. Okay, yeah, so someone asked, can we go back to the past precedents part? Can you give us an example of the trend in democracy and how you can use that in a motion? So I don't really think there is, I don't think there's a particular trend in democracy per se. Like democracy is just a theory. You could, and probably like it's not very useful for you to point to trends of like how developing democracies were able to develop. But I think if you were to use that way up of like, this is like there is precedence or there is consistency, the easiest way for you to use that way up is to, I guess, prove empirically why something is more true than another thing, right? So if the motion was something about the strategy for a developing country to get developmental aid or develop a lot faster or a lot better, you can prove an argument to be true, or like you can prove that this strategy is good because it creates this outcome. Potentially the past precedence point of weighing or mechanism of weighing is used to, I guess, intuition pump that argument a lot more. So to say, this has worked in XYZ countries, and it's because they employed XYZ conditions. And that's why if you employ those conditions, you are able to get the same outcome, right? But again, that probably isn't the most, the strongest way to use that way up, because oftentimes the application of that way up is to things like legality, right? So for instance, I think the example that I use a lot is the finals of Docks Bridge 2. In that final, the teams were trying to argue why the world of karmic reincarnation is a more fair world, right? Or is a more preferable world because it is more fair, right? So that was kind of the metric, I think. And the closing opposition was able to prove why this is consistent with a lot of like legal principles or legal doctrines that we currently have, or our best iteration of what good legality or correct legality is, right? That's usually like where you would use that weighing a lot more. So you can prove a lot of different principled ideas of like what is fair or what is unfair. The best way for you to prove why your arguments are more important is to say, this is what a lot of people consider as fair, or this is what we as a society have throughout the broad sweep of history end up considering to be more fair than other things, right? So I think that is where it usually applies, because we don't really know what is legal, or like what is like morally correct on a social level, other than what people say is morally correct on a social level, or other than what people have agreed to be morally correct on a social level. So that way up, I think, would be used, would be more beneficial there. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. Okay, if anyone else has anything else, you can just unmute or you can type it in the chat. Otherwise,
There's a question
okay.
from our YouTube viewers. How do you respond to a very excellent debater? To the point, it is hard to rebut such authorities.
How do you respond to what? Sorry,
To
can
a
you?
very excellent debater.
Okay. We'll see. That's okay. So that's quite subjective, but I think responding to a very excellent debater, respond widely, right? They say they say like they're probably able to bring a case line, right? So okay, if it's an excellent debater, I would assume they would have a clear enough case line as to here's what the argument is, right? And it probably might be quite nuanced. What I say oftentimes is, if a debater is able to flesh out many reasons for why an argument is likely, the best thing that you can do is to either respond to those mechanisms, but that would take a lot of time. But if you're able to do that with your argument, then great. If you aren't able to do that, you frame it out, right? And that's the easiest way to win the round, right? So it's like, if the argument is a clear case about how you get, so I think the easiest way to explain this is, let's go with social movements. You know, that's the easiest way. Social movements. One team is able to fully explain why you get more followers for your movement, right? And it's like an airtight case. You just cannot destroy it. You just cannot show why people end up not wanting to follow that movement. Then the best thing for you to do as a debater in the opposing side is to, I guess, you can just concede to it, right? Like if it's completely correct, you can concede, yes, you get more followers. But remember, the way that someone, like, an argument always has a rebuttal to it. If you can't rebut the mechanisms for why it is likely that you get more followers, you can rebut the conclusion, as I've explained. Like, the conclusion is that more followers means critical mass, means more capacity to do things as a social movement. The best way to respond to that is to say, you get more capacity to operate as a social movement on our side of the house, and here's why, right? So I think you have to do a lot of direct comparison between this particular team. And if all else fails, again, you are allowed to concede, but you do have to have a way for to like get out of that concession, right? So it's like, concede, yes, you get critical mass, but you aren't able to get progress. So it's kind of like saying, so okay, like let's say it was like that, right? They get a lot of followers. Social movement debates are quite interesting in the way that you can't just prove that you get a lot of followers or that you create mob mentality, but you also have to prove that the movement is able to develop into the future. What that says is, like, it's not just about it isn't just about the first, like, being able to get a lot of followers per se. It's also about being able to progress from first wave feminism to second wave feminism to third wave feminism, right? So you can argue that by saying it's just not as important because the impact is quite tiny. A lot of followers don't mean anything insofar as you don't get a lot of progress for that social movement, right? So I think that is the way that you can actually respond to that argument. It's not really to just you can concede to it to some extent, and then after you concede to it, you develop like a better case, or you develop a better way to reach that conclusion, right? So the way you think about debating, or the way that you think about that speech, is to not get sucked into all their mechanisms, but rather to understand what the conclusion is and how you are able to absorb that conclusion on your side. Okay, so that was for that question. Hopefully that answers it. Someone asked, okay, how do you identify and or avoid strawmanning in debates, especially when the debates that has really changed for me. Oh, okay, yeah. So I would think, okay, so to answer that, I would think like usually judges would be able to understand that. So I guess it's also a point for judging as well, which is that they're like an unresponded to argument does not mean the argument falls, or an argument incorrectly represented by another team doesn't mean the argument falls. So just take note of that to like, I guess, help you take that into consideration that you are probably fairly assessed in a majority of rounds. But I guess even if you don't, how do you mitigate that and how do you operate on that into the round? So the way that you mitigate that is to be able to put a lot of even ifs, right? Because the point is, an unintuitive argument is likely to be strawmanned. So an argument about why the economy will be stronger is going to be strongman, like is going to be strongman to you being privileged and you being unable to care about the poor or the vulnerable, right? You have to respond to that in preemption or in impacting. So in preemption, you say, even if the opposition says you had to prioritize poor individuals, our side was able to do that by giving them welfare programs or by having more capital to do that welfare program, or by building even more political capital so that people saw like those programs as beneficial and are more likely to support it in the next government election or something like that, right? So it was kind of it's kind of like you like it's up to you as well to make sure other teams don't strawman you, to make sure that if it is an unintuitive argument or if it is a case that is out there, for instance, that you do not give room for the other team to say you're not explaining this side of the story, right? You have to include that in your arguments. But I think the other way to do that is to POI, right? So as of now, it is required for you in BP to answer one POI. Like it is a requirement. It is not something preferable. It is a requirement. So given that it is that it is a requirement, it is best for you to POI teams. If you're like, I'm assuming this is like opening government in which you are not able to respond to OO or like respond to DLO or to the closing teams. In that case, you POI them. And the best way that you POI them is to just bring back the most powerful thing from your case. And that just reminds the judge, hey, like I already talked about this. Why are they strawmanning me, right? So those are probably the two methods. Method one is probably best just because preemption is really good as long as you want your case to win from OG or win from an opening team. But yeah, that's about it. And I think Irene said this is the last question. Thank you all so much. I have sent these slides again to Irene, and I guess if you have any further questions, you can contact me anywhere. I think you can contact me on Instagram. Yeah, contact me on Instagram if you want. I'll plug my Instagram in the YouTube info section if that's possible. But yeah, thanks everyone. And yeah, thank you, Irene, for having me as well.
Hi, yeah, so I just got disconnected.